This image sits in an underground chamber beneath a temple at Dendera in Egypt. An elongated oval. Inside it, a serpent. Below, a support that looks like an insulator. To the side, a cable running to a figure who holds it the way you'd hold a power cord. For 50 years, you've been told this is a lamp. Proof that ancient Egypt had electricity 3,000 years before Edison. I believed it too. Until I checked one thing. Not what is carved here. When. You're looking at the same section of wall twice. 60-odd years separate these two images, and 7 discrepancies that can't be explained by a careless artist or a bit of crumbled plaster. I spent weeks on this story. By the end of it, I had 3 things I can prove to you. 1. The theory of ancient Egyptian electricity has an exact birthday, and it is not the age of the pharaohs. 2. The temple sold to you as ancient Egyptian is younger than Julius Caesar, and mainstream archaeology agrees. 3. Europeans really did cut into Dendera, not in theory, with saws and gunpowder, and they carried a piece of the temple back to France. Stay to the end, because the hardest question in this investigation isn't the one I ask historians, it's the one I ask my own theory. And my theory barely survives it. Let's start with a simple question nobody seems to answer in the videos about ancient electricity. Who said this was a lamp first? Egyptologists, after a century of studying the temple. Physicists, after running the numbers. Archaeologists, after a find in the sand. None of them. The theory came from Peter Krasse, an Austrian writer, and Reinhard Habeck, an illustrator and journalist. They published it in a book that came out in the early 1980s. Hold on to that. The ancient mystery you're being sold is younger than the personal computer. It wasn't born in a laboratory or at a dig site. It was born at a writing desk, when 2 men looked at a religious carving and saw an object familiar from their own century. But a picture alone doesn't make a global sensation. You need a demonstration. And one arrived. An Austrian engineer built a working gas discharge lamp modeled on the carving. Cameras filmed it. Millions of people watched an ancient Egyptian lamp light up. Now look closely at what that experiment actually proved. It proved that a 20th century man with glass, a vacuum pump, an inert gas, and a few thousand volts can build a glowing tube and shape it like a picture on a wall. That's all. Nothing more. By the same logic, I could cut a silhouette out of a cave painting, glue a propeller to it, and announce that Cro-Magnons had aviation. A working model proves what its builder could do, not what the person who drew the original knew. So ask yourself, what should have survived in Egypt if electricity had actually been used there? Copper on an industrial scale. Evidence of wire drawing. Insulators. Glassworks capable of blowing a bulb to that shape. A power source, chemical or mechanical. Tools to maintain it. And above all, one text. The Egyptians left us grain inventories, worker rosters, embalming instructions, medical papyri with prescriptions. People who kept written accounts of sacks of barley left not a single line about a light source that would have transformed their entire civilization. None of it exists. Not one fragment. 2 centuries of excavation in Egypt and not a scrap of wire, not a shard of a bulb. At this point, somebody always says 2 words, Baghdad battery. Fine, let's take that apart too, since we're checking everything. It's a clay vessel with a copper cylinder and an iron rod inside, found near Baghdad. In the 1930s, a German researcher named Wilhelm Koenig suggested it was a galvanic cell. 3 things nobody mentions about that jar. First, it isn't Egyptian. It was found in Mesopotamia, 1,500 kilometers from Dendera. Second, it isn't from the age of the pharaohs. It's dated to the Parthian or Sassanid period, around the turn of our era or later. It's younger than most Egyptian temples. Third, and most awkward, even filled with an acidic solution, A cell like that produces about 1 volt. 1. The discharge tube that Austrian engineer built needs thousands. To get there from jars like this, you'd need several thousand of them wired in series with conductors running between them. Thousands of jars, of which, apart from a handful, none have ever been found. The mainstream explanation is much duller. A container for storing rolled papyri or small objects, with the copper cylinder as a sleeve.
So the one physical exhibit for ancient electricity turns out to be a scroll case from the wrong country in the wrong century.
Now, since we're auditing everyone, here's what Egyptology actually says the carving shows.
On the standard reading, the elongated oval is a stylized lotus flower with a serpent emerging from it. The serpent is a form of Harsomtus, Horus who unites the two lands, the son of Hathor and Horus. The support beneath the oval is a Djed pillar, the symbol of stability and the spine of Osiris. The figure with raised arms is He, the personification of infinity, a completely standard character in Egyptian iconography.
The whole scene reads as a creation image, the birth of the solar god from the primordial lotus. And here's what matters. Every one of those elements appears hundreds of times elsewhere in Egyptian art. In tombs, on papyri, in other temples. The lotus, the serpent, the Djed pillar, and the figure of He existed long before Dendera, and they never once assembled themselves into a machine. What turned this combination into a device was the eye of a person who has a light bulb screwed into a socket at home. Now, I should have closed the case here. The theory is 40 years old, there's no evidence, and its author wrote science fiction. But when I went into the archives to bury this version for good, I found something I wasn't looking for.
Not proof of ancient electricity. Something worse. Every argument about Dendera works the same way. One side says, it's a lamp. The other says, it's a lotus, a serpent, and a Djed pillar, a sacred scene of the sun's birth. A third says, it's the primordial mound.
Notice what all three have in common.
They're all arguing about the meaning of the image. And all three quietly agree on one thing, that the image is ancient.
And that is exactly what nobody checks. Because meaning can be argued forever. You see a lamp, your neighbor sees a flower, an Egyptologist sees a cosmogonic myth. An argument about meaning has no floor. You can spend 100 years down there.
Age is different. Age leaves traces, dates, engravings, photographs, expedition diaries, excavation reports. You can lay two pictures of the same wall side by side and look.
So that's what I did. And now, I have to tell you the things about Dendera that both sides of the argument usually skip. Start with the date of construction. The one that always comes out as 3,000 years ago in videos about ancient electricity.
The Temple of Hathor at Dendera does not belong to the age of the pyramids. There's a gap of roughly 2,500 years between it and Khufu. The building you see in photographs was built in the Ptolemaic period, and its famous columned facade was finished under the Romans. There are Roman imperial cartouches on these walls: Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, Domitian, Trajan. Think about that. Tiberius is the emperor of the New Testament. The building sold to you as the gray antiquity of the pharaohs is younger than Julius Caesar.
And that's not all that's standing on these walls.
On the outer south wall of Dendera, there's a relief tourists photograph more than any other. A woman and a boy beside her, making offerings to the gods.
That's Cleopatra. The 7th Cleopatra, the one you're thinking of. And her son, Caesarion, the child whose father was said to be Julius Caesar.
Let that land. The wall you're looking at was carved while a woman Caesar knew and Mark Antony loved was still alive. This is not a fog of antiquity. This is a specific, documented moment of history, described by classical authors down to the detail. That is the moment when the temple was going up. The temple, with the pharaoh's lamps in its basement. This isn't my theory. This is the official dating that every Egyptologist agrees on. It just never makes it into the lamp videos because the ancient Egyptians had electricity sounds impressive, and Roman subjects under Tiberius had electricity sounds like a municipal utilities dispute.
First layer of the myth, gone. Dendera isn't what you've been told, even by the mainstream.
Now the second layer. Where exactly are these famous lamps?
Not on the facade, not in the main hall, not where the tourists walk with their cameras. They're in the crypts, narrow underground chambers in the thickness of the walls beneath the temple. Rooms the size of a hallway reached down a vertical shaft.
That matters more than it sounds, because the crypts are the one place in the temple where a lack of soot on the ceiling would genuinely need explaining. You've heard the argument dozens of times. No torch marks underground, therefore electric light. The answer is simple and boring. An oil lamp with a clean wick barely smokes, and the walls of Egyptian underground chambers were cleaned and whitewashed many times over. But the fact that these carvings are tucked away in service basements is already a problem for the legend. A civilization that invented electric light does not hide the picture of it in a cupboard.
So, the temple is younger than advertised. The lamps are in a basement. The theory is 40 years old.
You'd think that's the end, and it's exactly at this point that I hit the contradiction I still cannot explain.
To understand it, you need one fact about Dendera that never comes up in these videos. The temple did not stand in the desert, clean and empty, the way it looks in modern photographs. It was buried. For centuries, Nile silt, sand, and rubble raised the ground level. Only the upper part of the facade stood above the surface. Everything else, the lower registers of carving, the bases of the columns, the doorways, lay under the earth. And there's more. A village stood on and around the temple. People lived in structures built against the ancient walls, kept livestock, stored grain. Hold that picture. Not a monument behind a fence with a ticket booth. A residential district grown onto a temple.
And that district left marks that are still on the stone.
Look at the columns of the facade. Each one carries the face of the goddess Hathor with cow's ears. And almost every face has been smashed. Not weathered, not crumbled by time. Chiseled off, deliberately, feature by feature.
The French didn't do that, and neither did any forger. Those are the marks of the early Christian era, when pagan images were destroyed as idols. There is still an early Christian basilica standing inside the Dendera complex, built right on the grounds of an Egyptian sanctuary. Remember that, too. The walls of Dendera really were altered. Images on them really were destroyed. That's a documented fact. It just didn't happen in the 19th century, and it wasn't done by Europeans. Now the ceiling of the main hall.
For centuries, fires burned inside this temple. People cooked, kept warm, lit the rooms. The soot from those fires coated the ceiling of the hypostyle hall in a layer so thick that the reliefs beneath were almost invisible. For decades, tourists photographed a black vault without suspecting there were images under it.
In our own time, that layer began to be cleaned away, and under the soot, a painting emerged. The sky goddess Nut in blue stretched across the entire ceiling. Zodiac signs, constellations, colors so vivid they look freshly applied.
Now take that back to the conversation about lamps. The central argument for ancient electricity goes, there's no soot in the Egyptian underground, so no fire burned there, so there must have been another light source.
And at Dendera, there was so much soot it hid an entire ceiling for centuries. Now, the chronology.
1799. The French army enters Upper Egypt. Traveling with the soldiers is Dominique Vivant Denon, an artist and engraver in his 50s. He draws Dendera, and in his own drawings the temple appears exactly as described. The lower portion underground, the ground level risen to the upper registers.
That's the first thing to fix in your mind. Denon understood perfectly well what condition the building was in. He drew it himself. 1802. Denon returns to France and publishes his Travels in Lower and Upper Egypt. The book becomes a European bestseller and launches the craze for all things Egyptian. For most readers, it is the first image of an Egyptian temple they have ever seen in their lives.
1809. The first volume of the Description of Egypt appears, the enormous state publication produced by dozens of the expedition's artists and engravers. Its Dendera plates are still reproduced in books and on websites today as documentary evidence. 1821. Remember this date in particular. We'll come back to it, and you won't like it. 1862. The British photographer Francis Bedford arrives in Egypt, accompanying the Prince of Wales on his tour of the Middle East. Bedford photographs Dendera. Look at that photograph. The people at the entrance are standing almost level with the upper registers of carving. The earth reaches nearly to the lintel of the portal. Where a tourist today tilts their head back to look at 3-meter figures, in 1862, there was packed ground.
63 years after the French arrived. The temple is still buried. The 1860s and 70s. And here I have to name a man who somehow never comes up in the lamp videos.
Auguste Mariette, a French archaeologist, founder of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, the man who cleared Dendera and published a multi-volume study of it.
Notice what I'm doing here. Other videos say at this point that official history is silent, that nobody will tell you who cleared the temple or when. That is false, and any viewer can disprove it in 1 minute with a search engine. The clearance is documented. It has a name, reports, and publications attached to it.
I'm naming him myself, because I'm going to need your trust later, and building it on concealment is a bad plan.
The 1880s.
Photographs show the work underway, the ground lower, new rows of figures exposed. But the base still hasn't been reached.
The early 20th century.
The facade is open, almost to its foundations. The sections Bedford could never see can now be examined at full height. So, Dendera wasn't freed from the earth in a single season. It took decades, from Mariette's time to the beginning of the last century.
Now take that chronology and lay the 1809 engraving next to it.
The plate from the Description of Egypt shows more than the top of a portal sticking out of the ground. It shows the lower registers, figures, inscriptions, decorative bands. Precisely the level of wall that, in the 1862 photograph, lies under meters of packed earth.
How? How did an artist working in 1799 depict something that was still buried 63 years later? And don't tell me about a later catastrophe that buried the temple again. Denon refutes that himself. In his own 1799 drawings, the temple is already buried. He drew the layer of earth. He knew it was there. And he still showed what lay beneath it.
Which leaves exactly 4 possibilities. 1. The French cleared a section, drew it, and left, and the ground slid back. Then there should be records. You cannot excavate that mass of earth with a military expedition and leave not one line about it.
2. The engravers of the Description of Egypt invented the lower portion, in which case that plate stops being a document and it is still being used as one. 3. They copied from an earlier source we know nothing about. And 4. The one I arrived at myself, and the one I'm still uncomfortable saying out loud. The engraving doesn't show what was on the wall. It shows what somebody intended to put there. Before you decide I've lost my mind, let's just compare 2 pictures. Forget the names of the gods. Which one is Osiris? Which is Isis? What the staff in his hand signifies? None of that matters right now. We only need outlines. A man, a woman, a child. Left to right, and we count.
Difference 1. The man's arm. On the engraving, it extends forward, almost horizontal. On the stone, it's bent and held close to the body. It isn't a change in the gesture of the fingers, it's the entire line of the limb, shoulder to wrist. On its own, trivial. The engraver was in a hurry. Moving on. Difference 2. The staff.
On the engraving, it stands almost vertical and ends near the head. On the wall, it's tilted, a different length, running along the body. And the top is different. The engraver shows a plain, straight end. The stone has an additional finial, also explainable. The artist simplified. Moving on. Difference 3. The clothing and the legs.
On the engraving, the hem forms a level line almost to the ankles. On the stone, the edge is shorter, the curve is different, the legs are placed differently. Even the distance between the feet doesn't match. 3 small things in a row. Nothing criminal so far. Now pay attention. Difference 4. The hieroglyphs.
On the engraving, the signs above the figures are gathered into compact vertical columns. On the modern wall, some are shifted, some appear in a different order, some occupy more space. There are signs between the figures that Denol's plate doesn't have at all, and individual symbols from the engraving are simply not present on the corresponding section of wall. Now that's more interesting. Because simplifying an ornament is one thing, rearranging written characters is another.
Difference 5. The woman's headdress.
This one is my favorite. On the engraving, a compact form above the head with a rounded finish. On the modern wall, the headdress is substantially taller, more complex, made of several visually separate parts. That is not a hand that slipped. Those are 2 different silhouettes. Different enough that if you saw them separately, you would not realize they were meant to be the same figure.
Difference 6. The child. On the engraving, the small figure stands apart. The legs are distinct. The pose is mid-stride. One arm reaches forward. The head is roughly level with the adult's hip.
On the stone, the child stands closer, partly merging with the adult's outline, the legs almost still, the head raised higher. Say the artist got the scale wrong. That happens. Now explain to me why, along with the scale, he changed the pose, the gesture, the position of the head, and the figure's whole place in the composition.
Difference 7. The objects in their hands. On the engraving, one figure holds a short staff pointing downward. On the wall, in that same place, there's a longer element with a different terminal. On the neighboring figure, an object Denol rendered clearly is either missing or has merged into the other lines of the relief. 7. Not 1, not 2, 7.
Now, let's be honest with each other. Every one of those differences has an explanation. The engraver worked from somebody else's sketch. The printing plate was cut by a third man who had never set foot in Egypt. The original drawing was made in a military camp, in the heat, between marches. And behind those explanations sits something worth spelling out, because it accounts for half of every argument ever had about the description of Egypt.
These plates were not made by one person, and almost none of the people who made them had seen Egypt. Here's how it worked. In the field, under escort, in punishing heat, between the army's movements, a draftsman made a pencil sketch, sometimes in an hour, sometimes from memory that evening in camp. Those sketches were then shipped to France. There, they were sorted, tidied, arranged into plates. Then a plate went to an engraver, a metal specialist who had never been to Dendera, knew nothing of Egyptian iconography, could not read hieroglyphs, and was physically incapable of telling a meaningful sign from a meaningless one. The publication took around 20 years, its volumes appearing into the late 1820s. Hundreds of people worked on it. Now picture what happens to a sign that, to the engraver, is just a squiggle. He straightens it, simplifies it, puts it where the composition looks better. He isn't damaging a document. He has no idea he's holding a document. To him, it's ornament. That is why the hieroglyphs on the plates of the description of Egypt are shifted, rearranged, and partly invented. Not from malice, because the man with the burin didn't understand he was copying writing.
And that, unfortunately, accounts for my 4th difference. The one I thought was the strongest.
All true. All of it genuinely explains one difference. 2, possibly 3, but we have 7 in a row, and they run through almost every figure in the scene. Arms, staffs, clothing, headdresses, the position of the child, the spacing between figures, and the placement of entire groups of signs.
At some point, the quantity of errors stops being error and starts being a property of the source, which raises the question that changes the whole picture. What if the engraving isn't a copy at all?
Here is my theory. I'm labeling it plainly. This is an authored hypothesis, not an established fact. I'm going to take it apart myself shortly. The 1809 engraving doesn't show what was already carved on the wall. It shows what was expected to be there.
Not a copy, a design, a reconstruction, a projected image of how the monument was meant to look once it had been cleared and finished. Look at how neatly this closes every gap.
Why does the engraving show lower figures that were buried? Because the artist didn't need to see them. He wasn't depicting what was found. He was depicting what was proposed.
Why are there 7 discrepancies?
Because between a design on paper and its execution in stone, deviation is inevitable. Carvers change proportions, move signs, simplify one thing and elaborate another, exactly as we just saw.
Why is there no blank space on the engraving? No note saying, "Wall buried below this line"? Because a design doesn't show the obstacle. A design shows the result.
But any theory like this has a problem of scale. Reworking a temple isn't 2 men with a chisel. It's access to the monument, money, craftsmen, security, years of labor, and total control over what Europe learns about it. Who could have supplied all of that? And here, the biography of one man starts reading very differently. Dominique Vivant Denon was born in 1747. By the time of the Egyptian campaign, he was in his 50s, with a full career behind him: artist, engraver, writer, diplomat. He had served under Louis XV, carried out commissions at European courts, understood art, and, this is the important part, understood exactly how culture serves political power.
The revolution nearly cost him everything. But he didn't merely survive it. He ended up closer to the new regime than he had ever been to the old one. Connections helped, among them his acquaintance with Joséphine de Beauharnais, the future wife of Napoleon. In 1798, he goes to Egypt with the army. He draws, he returns, he publishes the book.
And in 1802, Napoleon appoints him director of the Central Museum of the Arts, soon to be the Musée Napoleon, and after that, the Louvre. He holds the post until 1815.
Stop for a second and understand what that job is.
Denon decided which objects entered the principal museum of Europe, how they were displayed, what the label said, which works of art the army removed from conquered countries, and which of them the public would ever see. He accompanied military campaigns and personally selected the spoils. He supervised the artists, engravers, and medallists who produced the official imagery of the empire.
The man who drew the first mass-market image of Egypt was, 3 years later, given power over how Europe looked at antiquity in general. He was not an observer with a sketchbook. He stood at the source of the material and at the tap through which that material reached the public.
Now back to the date I asked you to remember.
1821. That year, Europeans came to Dendera not to draw. They came to cut.
Set into the ceiling of one of the temple's chapels was a circular relief, the famous Dendera zodiac, a map of the sky with its constellations. A Frenchman, Sébastien Louis Saunier, organized its removal. The work was led by a mason named Claude Lelaurin. The ceiling was cut out of the temple using, by documented accounts, saws, jacks, and gunpowder. A block weighing several tons was lowered, dragged to the Nile, loaded onto a vessel, and shipped to France. Today, the Dendera zodiac hangs in the Louvre, the same Louvre that Dominique Vivant Denon had directed 6 years earlier. and Denon was alive to see it. He died in 1825, 4 years after the Zodiac arrived in Paris.
That is not a hypothesis. That is a fact, with a date, names attached, and an exhibit you can go and look at with your own eyes. Europeans physically altered Dendera. They removed pieces of it. The temple presented to tourists today as untouched ancient heritage is a building with its ceiling cut out.
And if the Europeans of the 19th century considered it normal to saw several tons of stone out of a temple and ship it to another continent, then the question of whether they might have added a little carving to its walls stops sounding insane.
And this story has a sequel that makes it better still.
Saunier didn't remove the Zodiac for science. He removed it to sell. The French crown bought it, by widely repeated accounts, for something in the order of 150,000 francs. It was a commercial operation. Find it, cut it out, ship it, sell it. And then a scandal broke out around that stone, which completely inverts the usual picture of science versus the alternative crowd.
The zodiac depicts a night sky with constellations. So some scholars of the day set about calculating, from the arrangement of the figures, when exactly that sky had been observed. The numbers that came back were monstrous for the period. Many thousands of years before our era. Do you see what that meant in the 1820s? It meant Egypt was older than biblical chronology, that the world existed before the accepted date of creation. The public was delighted, the church was furious. And the argument over the age of the Dendera zodiac became one of the loudest intellectual brawls of its time.
And do you know who closed it? Napoleon. He read on the monument a word of Greek origin, autokrator, an imperial title. And he declared that the zodiac belonged not to unimaginable antiquity, but to the Roman period.
So in real history, the opposite happened to what you've been told. It wasn't scholars aging Egypt up for the sensation. The public wanted antiquity, and the decipherment of hieroglyphs sharply made the monument younger and ruined the party for everyone. Remember that detail. We're going to need it in a few minutes. My theory now completes itself.
First, a building with different decoration, partly buried, carrying Greek inscriptions and Roman cartouches, whose origins still had to be explained to a European public. Then, a paper design for its future appearance, developed by members of the expedition. Then the clearance, the carvers at work, plaster in the places where the surface needed leveling, and old cutting needed hiding. And finally, the publications, the museum collections, and the scholarly volumes that cite one another and turn the result into antiquity. And the famous lamps in the crypts, in this scheme, are not a picture of lost technology. They're a composition made by people who had already seen experiments with electricity, who knew glass vessels, discharge tubes, and arc devices, and who poured familiar shapes into an exotic subject. A double hoax. 19th century craftsmen make a mysterious relief with no lamp in mind at all. And a century and a half later, a science fiction writer looks at it through the eyes of the electrical age and declares it proof of ancient technology.
Beautiful theory. Everything fits. Everything fits a little too well.
I could stop here, cue the dramatic music, say, "And we all believed it," roll credits. That's exactly what every video in this genre does. Take the theory to a satisfying full stop and never test it. I'm not going to. Because a theory that hasn't survived testing isn't an investigation. It's a magic trick.
I found 3 objections to my own hypothesis. It survives one. It barely survives the second. It does not survive the third at all.
Objection 1. Volume. Dendera isn't covered in relief on a single panel. We are talking about thousands of square meters of carving. Walls, columns, ceilings, crypts, exterior surfaces. And that's one temple out of dozens. Edfu, Kom-Ombo, Philae, Karnak, Luxor. To cut all of that in the 19th century, you'd need an army of carvers working for years in full view of the local population, of travelers, of competing European powers, and later of tourists with cameras. And not one complaint, not one invoice, not one craftsman who talked. My theory survives this, but only if you shrink it to a minimum. Not all of Egypt was falsified, but individual sections were completed and restored during clearance. Which, incidentally, is documented 19th century restoration practice and no sensation at all. Objection 2. Witnesses before the French.
Napoleon was not the first European at Dendera. 18th century travelers were there before him and left descriptions and drawings of Egyptian monuments long before any expedition.
If those accounts mention figures in characteristic crowns and fields of hieroglyphs on the walls of Dendera, the theory of French authorship collapses immediately.
My theory barely survives this one, and only until I check the specific text. Let me say that plainly. Until I go through those editions, page by page, this hangs by a thread.
Objection 3. And this one kills it. Hieroglyphs were deciphered in 1822. Champollion published his Letter to Monsieur Dacier 13 years after the engraving we've been analyzing. Before that moment, nobody in Europe could read Egyptian writing. It was believed to be symbolic cryptography, a set of mystical allegories. Now put it together. If the French, between 1799 and 1809, carved fields of hieroglyphs onto the walls of Dendera, then they carved text in a language they could not read, could not compose, could not even distinguish from gibberish. And what is read on those walls today?
Coherent text, with correct late Egyptian grammar, with the names of specific Roman emperors in the cartouches: Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, Domitian, Trajan, matching the real chronology of Roman rule in Egypt, with astronomical and calendrical sections, with temple hymns that echo texts from other temples cleared by entirely different people in entirely different decades. And remember how Champollion got his key in the first place.
The Rosetta Stone was found by French soldiers in 1799, during the very campaign in which Denon was drawing Dendera. The same text is written on it 3 times, in Greek, in Demotic, and in hieroglyphs. It was the parallel Greek text that made hieroglyphs approachable at all, which means that at the moment when, on my theory, the French were supposedly carving hieroglyphic fields onto the walls of Dendera, their own countrymen were still holding the undeciphered key in the baggage train. And here's the final nail. That same zodiac, cut out of the Dendera ceiling and shipped to Paris. If its composition had been invented by 19th century Europeans, then Champollion, reading the inscription on it, would have found the work of his own contemporaries. Instead, he found a Roman imperial title and dated the monument to precisely the period in which, on independent grounds, the temple was being built. A decipherment made after the engravings confirmed a date that none of the engraving's authors could possibly have calculated.
For my theory to be true, the forgers would have had to be fluent in 1800 in a language humanity only learned to read in 1822, and to have known in advance which grammatical structure a science that didn't yet exist would eventually confirm. That is impossible. Not unlikely. Not hard to explain. Impossible. My theory is dead. I spent weeks on it, and I'm telling you so directly because you have a right to know where an investigation ended in nothing.
And while we're here, let me say what could actually have proved a late reworking of that wall. Not hinted at, proved. First, tool marks. A copper or bronze chisel leaves a completely different cut profile in stone than a steel one. Under a microscope, the difference is visible. If steel 19th century tool marks had been found on the reliefs of Dendera, the conversation would have been over in a day.
Second, patina. A stone surface exposed to air for 2,000 years and one opened 200 years ago age differently. Different mineral crust, different depth of alteration, different salts. A fresh cut inside an old wall is visible to a specialist. Third, the plaster. Its composition can be analyzed. Ancient mortars and 19th-century mortars differ in binder, in aggregate, in impurities. If a mortar with a distinctly modern European composition had turned up beneath the reliefs, that would have been a sensation. Fourth, pigments. Prussian blue, synthesized in the 18th century, is impossible in ancient Egyptian painting. Egyptian blue, conversely, is uncharacteristic of the 19th. A single paint analysis closes the question. Notice that I have presented you with none of those analyses. Not for my theory, and not against it. I've shown you engravings, photographs, and reasoning, which is the level of a hunch, not of proof. And that, honestly, is the difference between an investigation and a genre. The genre stops where things get beautiful. An investigation stops where the data runs out, and says so. But now for the interesting part. The theory died. The facts I gathered along the way did not. There are 5 of them. 1. Dendera is not the age of the pyramids. The building is Ptolemaic, its facade finished under Roman emperors. It is younger than Julius Caesar. That is mainstream archaeology, and it already demolishes half the videos about the ancient electricity of the pharaohs. 2. The lamp theory was born in the early 1980s from a writer and an illustrator, not from Egyptologists. It is less than 50 years old. 3. The working model proved nothing except the skills of the man who built it. 2 centuries of excavation in Egypt have produced no wire, no bulb, no insulator, and not one line of text about a light source. 4. The reliefs are in underground service chambers. A civilization that invented electric light does not hide the picture of it in a cupboard. 5. Europeans really did cut into Dendera. In 1821, the zodiac was sawn out of the ceiling and taken to Paris, where it hangs to this day. The temple, presented as untouched, is a building with a piece removed. Look at what happened here. I went looking for a 19th century forgery and didn't find one. And I found a real forgery instead. Except it isn't in the stone, it's in the head. Nobody swapped the walls of Dendera. They swapped the context. A Roman-era building was declared hoary antiquity. A religious carving from a basement was declared a technical schematic. A guess by 2 Austrians was declared the thing they're hiding from you. None of that requires carvers, gunpowder, or a conspiracy. It only requires that each new storyteller repeats the last one without checking. And here's the real irony. The one genuine European intervention at Dendera, the removal of the zodiac, is known, documented, and hanging in open display in the largest museum on Earth. Nobody hid it. It's just less exciting than aliens. So what is on that wall? A late Egyptian religious scene, carved under Roman emperors in an underground chamber of a temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor. A serpent, a lotus, a Djed pillar. The people who cut it were not thinking about electricity and could not have been. The lamp arrived there in the 20th century. In our heads, because we look at the past with the instruments of the present and see familiar objects in it. Our great-grandfathers looked at the same reliefs and saw Masonic symbols. Theirs saw biblical scenes. We saw wiring. The next generation will see something of their own. A neural interface, anti-gravity, whatever is in the air. The question isn't what the Egyptians knew. The question is why we want so badly for them to have known it. And here's what I'm left with after weeks in the archives. I had tested my theory, and it failed. I'm telling you that honestly because an investigation isn't when everything adds up. An investigation is when you're prepared for it not to. But there's one thing I want to leave open. The one I never closed. I still cannot explain why the 1809 engraving shows lower registers of wall that, in the 1862 photograph, lie under meters of packed earth. I have 4 possible answers, and not one of them is backed by a document. Perhaps the answer is boring. An engraver in Paris completed the composition by analogy with other sections. Perhaps there was a brief excavation nobody recorded. Perhaps I misread the source myself. If anyone watching has the original volumes of the description of Egypt to hand, put the plate number in the comments and tell me what's actually on it. That's the only way to close this question, not by arguing, by opening the book. So what do you think? Where does the ancient relief end and the late restoration begin? And why do we want the past to have been more advanced than it was? Put your version in the comments. If this investigation made you check even one fact you thought was common knowledge, leave a like. It helps more people find the film. Subscribe and hit the bell. There are plenty more stories ahead where the official version turned out to be duller than the truth. And the truth is more interesting than the invention. See you soon.